The oven in the small bakery of Mercedes, Argentina, was only ever meant to feed a town. But for a boy with sawdust under his nails and a hunger for shapes, it was the first classroom. Horacio Pagani learned there how wood answers pressure, how grain and angle decide whether a toy car will roll straight or wobble into the gutter. You can see the same patience years later in an Italian workshop. The slow breath before a composite layup, the exact moment a piece of carbon fiber becomes sculpture. This is a story about those invisible repetitions, the quiet hours that build authority faster than any resume ever could. He crossed oceans with two things: a stubbornness people mistook for stubbornness and a set of ideas they called reckless. In Medina, among roaring V12s and sculpted egos, Pagani was the sweeper who watched lines, soot, and opportunity accumulate. The men he worked for polished their reputations. He studied their mistakes. When he began to champion carbon fiber, light, expensive, exotic, laughter followed like a soundtrack. Not for cars, they said, but ridicule is only a problem if you let it rewrite your ambition. He learned to answer with demonstration, not argument. He taught himself to make structure out of criticism. The gamble that turned a craftsman into an owner was not glamorous. It was a debt-heavy purchase of an industrial oven, an act that smelled of resin, oil, and something that looks dangerously like faith. He mortgaged sleep and social approval so he could control the curing, the temperature, the rhythm of creation. Nights with invoices piled on a workbench, mornings where a single measured failure could erase months of sacrifice. These are the scaffolding of success the textbooks neglect to mention. Pagani Automobili would not be born from one grand plan, but from 1,000 tiny reconciliations between vision and reality. Listen closely and you'll hear the real lessons beneath the lacquered bodywork. Craft that convinces, risks taken with a balance sheet in mind, and the slow conversion of overlooked talent into undeniable value. If you've ever felt unseen at work, if you carry a quiet conviction your idea is worth millions, consider this a gentle map. Tell us in the comments, what is your biggest professional pain? Why do you feel undervalued? If this resonates, like and subscribe to follow the Pagani method as we unpack it. Next, we will trace the exact moves, the financial turns and tiny rituals that transformed a baker's son and a factory sweeper into the owner of one of the world's most revered hypercar marques. The workshop smelled of oil, hot metal, and the sweeter resin of new composites. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead as machines clanked in a rhythm that felt almost like a heartbeat. A heartbeat Horacio had listened to since he was a boy carving wood in Argentina. Now in Medina, he moved through that heartbeat as a sweeper, broom in hand, eyes always on the machines, absorbing shapes, tolerances, the silent logic of how parts met. He learned the language of engineers by eavesdropping at benches and the language of craftsmen by watching their hands. Once, an older engineer shook his head at the mention of composites. Carbon fiber is a toy for the future, not an engine bay, he said. Horacio simply smiled. Then we'll show them a future that pays, he answered, quietly certain. Ridicule was immediate and public. At meetings, he stood next to skepticism like a patient teacher. You can't demand an oven and expect respect, a factory foreman told him when he proposed buying an industrial autoclave. You'll drown in debt. Horacio signed the papers anyway. He mortgaged his savings, persuaded a bank with a sketch and a stubborn conviction, and brought home that oven. A humming, expensive promise that changed everything. In the oven's light, sheets of carbon fiber ceased to be fragile and became structural poetry. The first panels he built were crude, imperfect, but they held up. That proof was the quiet authority he cultivated. Not loud boasts, but a single, undeniable result. He cultivated a workshop culture that married rigor to artistry. Artisans who had once been dismissed as just finishers became co-creators. Engineers learned to listen. Dialogue in those early days was terse and intense. Fit it again, Horacio would say, touching a seam. No excuses. When someone doubted a process, he invited them to the bench. Try it yourself. By forcing participation, he turned skepticism into investment. This is the realistic pattern behind his ascent. Relentless craft, a finance-fueled risk that had to be won, and the slow conversion of overlooked talent into institutional strength. If you've ever felt unseen at work, notice the lesson here. Competence demonstrated repeatedly is a quieter, stronger currency than rhetoric. Before we lay out the exact steps of the Pagani method, tell us in the comments. What's your biggest professional pain that makes you feel undervalued? Share it below, and if you want practical tactics for turning that pain into power, subscribe. The next segment will unpack the tactical spine of Pagani's gamble and how you can adapt it. The oven sat like a promise in the corner of the tiny workshop. An enormous, humming box Pagani had bought with borrowed money, the last piece that transformed plans into craft. The courtship with carbon fiber had been brutal. Engineers called it faddish, suppliers raised eyebrows, and old colleagues at Lamborghini shook their heads. Yet here, under the yellow light, Horacio moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had already lost enough to stop fearing loss. He touched a freshly cured panel, felt the cool, glassy weave beneath his fingers, and smiled as if answering a private question. "Will this be enough?" A mechanic, stood on his forearms, asked, "Boss, you sure we can sell a car like this?" Pagani looked up, calm as a man who had learned to let work do the arguing. "We won't sell a car," he replied softly. "We will sell an experience no one else thinks they can make." The workshop became a theater of obsessive detail. Jigs, minute rivets, hand-stitched leather that smelled of sun and patience. Nights stretched into mornings. Credit lines tightened, arguments with bankers lingered, but every setback was met with another revision, another late-night test. The first full assembly was the scene of both dread and reverence. Mechanics held their breath as the V12 growled to life, an animal of Italian sound cradled within a body of Argentine woodsmanship and Italian metallurgy. When that engine coughed into a steady rumble, something changed in the room. Ridicule turned into astonished silence. Clients came not for trophies but for a conviction they could feel beneath their palm, the unmistakable authority of craft translated into value. Recognition came slowly, then all at once. A journalist's skeptical piece became an ode after a test drive. Orders arrived from names who once ignored him. But the real victory was quieter. Pagani had converted the persistent doubt of others into a standard he alone set. The lesson is not romantic heroism. It's the Pagani method. Commit to craft, place strategic bets, let excellence speak when words fail. If you feel overlooked at work, what would you invest in to make your competence undeniable? Share your biggest professional pain in the comments. Our community listens. Subscribe to follow how Pagani scaled from a single oven to a world-class mark, because the next chapter shows how rarefied craft becomes a sustainable business, and how you can apply the same mechanics to your own climb. When the final panels slide into place and the last rivets are tightened, Horacio Pagani doesn't seek applause. He listens for the quiet approval of a metal that has been tamed, a composite that finally sings. That silence is the reward of a life spent proving a simple thesis. Excellence makes its own authority. From a boy carving toy cars in a kitchen in Argentina to a man who filled an oven with carbon fiber and debt, Pagani's journey is less myth than method. A slow, stubborn conversion of skill into reputation, ridicule into customers, risk into control. Picture the workshop at midnight. The fluorescent lights hum, the smell of epoxy hangs in the air, and under a single lamp Horacio tests a joint with the same care a jeweler reserves for a cut of diamond. He doesn't assign meaning to grand gestures. He collects small evidences, a perfectly formed curve, a customer who returns, an engineer who refuses to leave. These are the bricks of silent authority. He learned to accept being undervalued, not as defeat, but as currency. Each no sharpened his resolve. Each sneer taught him how to translate technical conviction into an aesthetic the world would covet. There are practical lessons here for anyone who sits unseen at their job. Master your material until you can teach it. Build artifacts that speak louder than titles. Take measured risks that buy you control, an oven, a mold, an independent bench, rather than status. Surround yourself with believers who will protect your standards. And accept that the calendar for recognition is personal. Pagani's timeline was not overnight, but relentless. If something in his story stirs you, a memory of being dismissed or a quiet certainty you carry about your own work, Tell us in the comments. What is your biggest professional pain? Why do you feel undervalued? Share one detail, and our community will respond with perspective and practical advice. If you found this journey useful, give the video a like and subscribe to follow more stories that cut through glamour to show the real mechanics of success. We will return with concrete steps from the Pagani method, how to take your craft, protect it, and make the world pay attention.